10.
Actually, it's going. They're all there. They're coming Friday.
Guys, I mean, I'll be in.
Hannah's birthday.
We're gonna celebrate Saturday, right?
And I've got all the tools and nails and stuff like this, so that.
Y'all heading anywhere? You going down to?
We ain't done it, see. We're going to Guam
Guam? Saturday.
next Saturday.
Wow.
Long.
You going? You going?
No.
5 of us. Me and Sharon, Kenny Street, West, Dillon, and some other. East Minnesota.
Mike said he don't speak Guam.
I don't know.
Guamese. All right, y'all. It's time I guess to start here. Good to see everybody. We've got a new book. I hope you got your books. They look different. Even the insides look a little different. They redesigned them to keep us all modern, I guess, more modern. But the unit of lessons that we're going to deal with as we study the book of Daniel is staying true in a world far from God. And you know, I don't know if it's because we are able to see the world better today than 50 years ago, with the internet, with TV, with all the ways that we can look at what's going on in the world. I never will forget that one time I had, I guess it was 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was listening to the news and heard there were riots on the streets of like Cairo, Egypt. And I was wondering what all was going on there. And my daughter, who, when she was young, didn't keep up with the news, you know, I said to her, you need to check the news because I think there's some rioting going on over in Egypt. And she says, I know all about it. I said, how'd you know about it? I just now found out about it. She said, this morning I was looking at Twitter and there was a person walking in the thing talking about it on Twitter, and I just kind of tuned in to hear what the people walking in it were talking about. And I just went, man, that's unbelievable. That's how we can stay involved in what's going on in the world. So I think a part of our understanding of the world that's far from God is that we know more about the world than we used to know, and we can see more of the world than we used to. But I think there's no question that that the world is far from God. I'm not sure the world hadn't always been far from God, but it is far from God. I think there are parts of the world that used to be close to God that are far from God now. Parts of the world that used to be far from God are closer to God now than they used to be. So I don't know how that all adds up, but I remember going to Wales with the Tennessee Baptist Men's Chorale, and I think that was in 2007. But anytime Robert and I are fixing to go to Guatemala with the Tennessee Baptist Men's Chorale, and before you go, they really want you to know a little bit about what's going on in that area of the world and what's going on in that country, and just demographics almost. And what they told us about Wales that surprised me, and it was about the United Kingdom really, is that only 5% of the United Kingdom confessed evangelical Christianity. 5%. And I thought it would have been similar to us here in the United States. And I remember that coming into my view when we rounded a corner. I was in a bus, but we rounded a corner, and there was a church. And I said, what a beautiful small church right there on kind of the corner of a street. And as we got close to it, I saw something on the steeple of it. And I didn't know whether that was a clock, big clock or something on it, or what it was, but it was a cartoon character when we got close to it. And I thought, well, what's going on there? And as we got closer, I realized as we passed by that it had been closed years ago and was now a daycare center, the church with a steeple. There wasn't even a church anymore. And they said, don't be surprised if you don't see many people come to the concerts that we would put on in a church, or that they would even know the songs we were singing. And I remember reading this about 10 or 15 years ago, a speechwriter, I think for George W. Bush, who said you had to be very careful, a speechwriter for the President of the United States using biblical references, because people wouldn't understand what you're talking about. Don't be talking about Jonah being swallowed by a big fish. They don't even know what you're talking about. They wouldn't even know what you're talking about. And a biblical reference they wouldn't get in a speech, so they have to quit doing it. And so I'm just saying the world is becoming far from God, and we worry, about the morality of the world, because we again can see that a little more than we used to be able to. But I remember, just from I guess knowing trivia, is that the first time a cuss word was used in a film was Gone with the Wind, and it was one word, and it pales in comparison to the words used today. That one is even a problem. But it caused people to boycott the movie, and today, for goodness sakes, that would be nothing, It's hard to find a movie that doesn't have some kind of that kind of language. And so anyhow, how do we stay true in that world? Okay, how do we stay true in that world? And so hopefully we're going to be studying that and learning from Daniel, how Daniel stayed true, and his friends. So the first thing we have to do is develop strong convictions. And we had our deacon elections this past couple of Sundays, and we have a new deacon, James Washburn. And I talked to James after court on Wednesday, and after telling him that he probably would fail all the questions at the I really kind of got after him. I decided to change and actually help him, and so we talked a long time, and I told him, I said, now, I would think that the other ordained men of our church in area that would come to the ordaining council would want to make sure that you had strong convictions, and that you understood and had beliefs that would be in tune and in line with what our church believes. We would expect that. And I said, I think that one of the best places to find that, and I think you already know where that is the Baptist Faith and Message. I said, I think I would get that out. He said, I've got one. I may have to dust it off. He said, blow the dust off.
They got it during the orientation.
But he said I figured so. I said, get that out and study it and make sure you believe what that says, because I think that our church believes what that says. And we just talked about that kind of thing. And I said, I think that the church itself, including in addition to the ordaining council, want to hear your testimony and want to know that you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, that you've accepted the grace of God, and that you have committed your life to Him. And I think we want to hear that story. And we just want to know that you've got strong convictions. And I think if we don't have them, we need to develop strong convictions if we want to stay true in a world that's far from God. And then what a wonderful point is that our convictions, not our circumstances, define who we are. Our convictions define who we are. And I think that's an important thing. And so let's see here what's happening. And actually, if you read the entire first chapter, we sometimes take things out of context a little bit, but in the context of it, it tells us that it was in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And when I read that, that's in the Christian Standard. That doesn't seem to be even grammatically correct, to me. Laid siege to it. Why do you have to say to it? You've already said that he gets to Jerusalem. He just laid siege, or they're laid siege. To me, that doesn't even seem accurate. So I'm going to have to disagree with the interpreters and translators there. That's not. Listen, in my house, Carol says her house is very similar. If I said something grammatically incorrect, now my daddy wouldn't even know I said it, but my mother would say, that's not accurate. And then she would correct me as if she was grading my paper, And so things like that just really bug me, that kind of thing. And when the first day of law school, this guy, Mayo Corner is his professor's name, Mayo Corner. He had a kind of a curly mustache, kind of a fancy kind of a guy, but he wrote the word judgment up on the board, Judgment. And he says to us, if any paper that you turn in has 2 E's in that, we're kicking you out of this law school. You won't be here another day of law school if you put 2 E's in that. I didn't make a lot of notes, but I made that note. And I'm telling you, if I see a 2 E's in that word, I just cringe. Like, what in the world were they thinking when they did that? Right? They put 2 E's in it. So anyhow, laid siege to it. This didn't seem to be. But anyhow, that's what happened. They laid siege to Jerusalem, and he captured it. 605 BC, I think, if you're putting down dates. But anyhow, the Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him. To me, that's important, because even evil people are controlled by God. Even foreign dictators are under the sovereignty of God. And God chooses. God's going to choose who wins in that war with Ukraine and Russia. It's God in control of that. It's not Putin, and it's not the other guy, Zelensky. It's God in control of that. And so God handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to Nebuchadnezzar. You hear that? He handed him over. His brother had been captured by Egypt, actually, and put him in charge. And then Nebuchadnezzar gets him. Also, some of the vessels from the house of God were handed over, the treasures. So anyhow, he carried them into the land of Babylon to the house of his God, okay, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. You know what the name of his God? What one of the names of his God was? Bel, okay? Bel. Similar to Baal, might be the same word, but Bel, and that's important in a few minutes when we look at the name of Daniel, because the name of that God, little g God, becomes a part of the name of Daniel. And what's interesting to me about that is that for some reason, Daniel allowed that, okay? And didn't even seem to fuss about it, but fusses about the food. I don't know what that means. But in his name is found the name of that God. We'll see that in a minute as we read it. But anyhow, that's where we are. They've been taken over into captivity, okay? And this is in the first 2 verses of that chapter. And I think there were 2 or 3 different times when people were taken into captivity. So thousands of people were taken, but there were 2 or 3 different waves of people taken. And Daniel in one of the early waves, and it's because Daniel was of the royalty. Nebuchadnezzar said, go get the most important people, the ruling house, and bring them over here, okay? And so we're here in verse 3 through 7 now. This is where we focus our attention. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judahites, I'd never heard that word before then, the Judahites, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. I bet you, right now, if you didn't look down, that you couldn't tell me the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because we know more about that, don't we, of all things. We can remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's in songs. It's in the great story that we'll, I'm sure, get to about the fiery furnace. And so I watched one on YouTube just the other day. It was a Gaither, video, but about they put 3 Men in the Fire. What a great song! But it's sort of a humorous song. But the who? The Statler brothers. It wasn't them on the Gaither thing though. It was somebody else. But you want to sing that real quick? It is good. But anyhow, so we know they're Babylonian names, not their Hebrew names. But anyhow, I think we see here that who they were. They were a member of the royal family, of the nobility. In the King James, I read it today, it said, men without blemish or without a spot, spotless, without a blemish. Almost like you were talking about a sheep, to be offered as an offering. But really, here, I think maybe a better translation here, without any physical defect. Men that were young men without physical defect. And so they were selected, these 4, and taken into your royal family, really. And Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, was to take them under his wing and was to teach them and train them, along with some other young men, apparently, from Babylonia, and maybe from other captured places. But these 4 men were brought there. And you know what it is to me? It's a picture of the world trying to assimilate our youth. Assimilate them. It's a subtle assimilation. Is what the king was trying to do. He was smart. He could get these guys, make sure they're loyal to him, and watch them, make sure they meet muster. And then they will be loyal to him. He can put them over those people, and those people won't be quite as mad at him if they've got their own person in charge. They will teach them then the language, and they'll teach them the customs and traditions and literature of the Chaldeans, And so, it's like you always hear the story about putting a frog in cold water on the stove, and then start turning the heat up, and they don't even realize they're fixing to be boiled. Or a lobster, whatever. It just starts getting warm. It's just getting warm. Then all of a sudden they're boiled, and it's too late. It's too late. And I think that's what Nebuchadnezzar, a pretty sharp guy. It was Nebuchadnezzar. Now we give him a hard time as an evil person, but he's the person that was responsible for all of the growth of Babylonia in its height. He's the one that built the Hanging Gardens, that were one of the wonders of the ancient world. He built the huge palaces and built the city. That city, Babylonia, first city in the world with over 200,000 people, and probably at the time of Daniel had 500,000 people. The largest city in the world. And so he was pretty progressive as far as civic leaders and kings and people. And this was a pretty decent idea, bring these young people in there, train them. But I think it is it's just one of those forms of assimilation to make them like him. That's what he was trying to do. And the world is trying to make us like the world, trying to make our children like the world. And they're doing it subtly. I can see it in Rome. I can see it in Eli, who's 5. I could see it when he was 3, that he wants to be like these things he's seeing. You ever noticed a kid can be playing and a commercial come on and they'll stop and look at the commercial? I'm telling you, that's scary, but that happens. So anyhow, that we see it here. Now, an interesting thing that I didn't know about the book of Daniel, it's split up into 2 parts. One is the history, that we're in right now. We're studying about the history. But then there's a prophecy part. More than half of it is prophecy. And it is written, it's one of the few books of the Old Testament written in 2 languages. It's not Guamese or anything. It's not in the language of Guam. But the first part, the history that deals with the Hebrew people, is written in Hebrew. The ancient scripts. The latter part, chapter 2 into chapter 7, was written more in what is called the Gentile, more of the Gentile area of the history, written in Aramaic. The final part, the prophecy, is for the Hebrew people, written in Hebrew. But one of the few books of the Old Testament written in 2 languages. And so interesting, because Daniel apparently wanted this second part of his history to be read by maybe both groups. Aramaic was the language of diplomacy of that day, like French, I think, is now. In the United Nations, French is what is used, and most diplomats are pretty conversant in that language. So anyhow, just a side note there that makes it an interesting book. But the purpose of the book, I think, is to share with us the history of captivity, at least with a small group of these people, the history. And history is important now. It's important, I think we would want to know, I wonder what it was like to be a captive in Babylonia. I wonder. We don't have to wonder, because the Bible tells us what it was like, We know that at first the people were extremely homesick. I went over to the Gleason Tatertown Parade yesterday, and I always stop by Gleason Lumber and talk to Mr. Clay, but there was one of his sons and one of his granddaughters, and she had on a UT jersey. And I said, now, where are you now? She said, I'm in Knoxville. I'm living in Knoxville, going to school in Knoxville. And the daddy said, and she's homesick, And I can imagine. I would be. I'd love Knoxville. I love the mountains, but I love to visit them. I like to live here, And I'm sure these people, and it shares that in Jeremiah and other books, they were extremely homesick. I'm sure these young men were homesick. They'd rather be back where they grew up and where they lived. And so we know they were homesick. In Jeremiah 29, that very familiar passage, to us, that God knows about us, and he's familiar with us, and he knows what's going on in our lives. But these people thought that God was fixing to come rescue them, but God had a plan of about 70 years here that he was going to leave them in captivity. And he told them, he said, what I want you to start doing now, y'all been here a little while and you're homesick, but I want you to start building houses, planting trees, planting crops, raising cattle, raising children, and settle in, because you're going to be here 70 years. Settle in. And these young men know that. They need to settle in. And so they settle in. And they do what God is requiring them to do here. But I think that one of the things that this book does to us is that it reassures us that God is sovereign. God is in control of this universe. He's in control of this world. And I think this book does that for us. Now, let's look down real quick at the name, the name Daniel. You know, the name Daniel means God is my judge. God with a big G. God is my judge. And the name Belteshazzar means protect his life. Okay? So it's a word of warning and protection for him. But it's also perhaps may Baal protect your life. May God with a little g protect your life, which is interesting. Or Baal's prince is what it could mean. And he accepts the name. And I don't think they were nicknames. I remember we used to go on World Changers, you know, and I'd be a crew chief sometimes, or at least helping the crew chief all the time. But I'd give every one of those kids nicknames. That's all I called them all week. And they would laugh about that, but I'd try to come up with a real good nickname. Do that for most of the kids that came from our church. I'd give them nicknames. I don't think these are nicknames. I think these are names that stuck with them there. And people called them by that name. So let's look at verses 8 now through 13. 8 through 13. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and drink. What if he sees your face looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. So we see here that Daniel determined that what the king's plan here about the diet was not going to work. For one thing, it wasn't kosher. I guarantee you this food they were offering was not kosher. That means it wasn't blessed by a Jewish rabbi, and it was inappropriate, unclean food. But it was unclean because of the type of food, but it was also unclean because a lot of it had been offered as an offering to Baal. Apparently, we find that somewhere else. But it had been offered to another god, inappropriate for them to eat. And so he said, I don't want to eat that. Can we eat something else? Can we eat vegetables that aren't offered to other gods? And so one wonderful thing here that we find is that the chief eunuch, the Ashpenaz, had come to really like Daniel. And he showed him kindness and compassion. And it's the word here, hesed, which is the kind of kindness and grace that God offers us. It's a godly type love and compassion. So that's the word that Daniel used, was hesed, love, and kindness. And so a wonderful relationship there. Now, a couple of things that I have experienced. One is that I worked for a Jewish lawyer in Memphis named Richard Cantor, and he was Orthodox. And so I've seen some of this dietary issue. And he had, for instance, 2 kitchens in his house, one for milk products and one for meat products. Meat and milk are never supposed to merge in the Jewish culture of the Orthodox. He always wore a yarmulke or a hat. He wore a prayer shawl. either over or under his shirt. He ate only kosher food. They only went to one restaurant in Memphis, and that was the Fiddler. It was over off of Mendenhall and Poplar. The Fiddler was kosher. And I remember one time his children came into the law office just excited, jumping up and down. And their dad said, what was going on? They said, Hormel has just come out with a turkey bacon, and we're going to get to eat bacon. And I said, what a terrible group of people this is. And what a tragedy. These children have never eaten bacon. And so, but they were kosher and really felt like that was, they needed to remain kosher. I guarantee you that John can tell you that on anything they sell, anything that's sold that's processed, usually on any can, ketchup, anywhere, there's a little circle that has a K on it, or a little circle that has a U on it, or a little circle with another letter. There's about 4 different letters that tell you whether that food's kosher or not, and whether a Jewish Orthodox person can eat it. And it depends on whether a rabbi has blessed it. A rabbi has to have blessed it before they can buy it or eat it. And a U is one of the rabbis out west. A K is probably northeast, kosher. And there are just lots of those letters, but look for that sometime. And what is interesting to me is that the wine was off limits, because I know this from Richard Cantor, all alcoholic beverages are kosher. They don't have to even be blessed. Alcoholic beverages are okay to the kosher society. But wine here was not. I don't know. Again, it may have had something to do with whether it was offered as a part of the religious ceremonies of that god, I think. And so, but anyhow, it is a big deal now, whether that food is according to the dietary restrictions of the book of Leviticus and other books of the law. And so that is important. And I think the other thing that we need to notice here, and I noticed this to me about Richard Cantor's kids. They didn't look healthy to me. They looked paler and skinnier. And I said to myself then often, those kids need some ribs and they need some bacon, and they need to put some fat back in their food, or they're not going to be healthy when they grow up now, poor things. And I often thought that when I'd see them. Well, right here, I actually think, honestly, that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have normally looked thinner than those other people. I think the story tells us, it tells me, maybe it speaks to me only, that God was in this, okay? God rewarded them for their convictions, and he made them healthy. And even though they were vegetarians drinking water, God made them healthy. And they weren't skinny. They were as plump and nice as they could be at the end of the 10 days. And at the end of the 3 years, they were not noticeably different, if not healthier. And when I think about that, I think about that Kit Kat commercial on TV where the 2 twins are looking at each other and it says, it doesn't make any difference which side. They're both juicy and they're sweet and tasty. And there's 2 bears behind them. And they're looking at the back of the 2 twins and said, it doesn't make any difference which one you pick. They're both juicy and tasty. But anyhow, this is silly, isn't it? But anyhow, wonderful thing here that they stood by their convictions in spite of where they were, that God knew where they were. God knew they were there. God saw them. God blessed them there at that place. I sang, Josh Tuesday went to First Baptist Nashville and spoke at a devotion there. And I went, and we know the guy that's the song leader there. So we sang a song, the 3 of us, at this meeting, and it was Ride the Morning Wind, which is a song that the David Johnson Chorus sang. But to me, it's just such a beautiful song because it tells us that God will find you no matter where you are in the world. And, it's like the point of the lesson. Our convictions, not our circumstances, define who we are. Not our circumstances, but our convictions. And their convictions defined who they were to these people. But you know what he found the right person there to ask this question to, because what he said was, we want to eat vegetables and drink water. You eat our meat. You eat our food. So here's this guy. He may not have usually been able to eat from the king's table, the guard, but he's eating their food, four of them's food. So he may have gotten real fat, during that 3 years, eating all of their food. I would have, if I'd have been him. Anyhow, I think a wonderful thing here, and I thought about this, is especially with food. I thought about coming into the cafeteria at Dresden, and we had 3 women there that all had nicknames. Y'all remember them? Pud Cooper. Y'all remember Miss Pud? Shug Brundage. Remember Miss Shug? And Dunk Morgan, who goes to our church, Miss Dunk. And they'd serve the food to you. And it just bothered me because I'd follow Tommy Thomas and Sandra Bradbury. I don't think I ever heard Mike say this. I can't imagine Mike saying it, but Tommy would say, why can't you serve us something besides this slop? Or something like that, and they'd say, I don't even want any of that. They wouldn't give Tommy Thomas and Sandra Bradbury enough food for a bird to eat. And they'd frown and scowl, and then they'd go down and beg for 2 rolls down there from Ms., what was her name? It's not Ms. Morgan, but Ms. Anyhow, she wouldn't give them half a roll. And then I would come in and say, because I believed it, I said, I don't see how y'all do it. Make food this good for this many people. This is as good as my mama fixes at home. And they would pile food on my plate, and they'd give me 2 or 3 rolls when I got down to the end. Because that's what Daniel did, don't you think? With that eunuch, and what Maureen Campbell said out there said, you get dished out what you dish out. That's what she said. I said, can I quote you on that? She said, you can. You're going to get dished out what you dish out. So there you go. And so let's look at the very last 2 verses real quick. 17 and 18 and 19, 3 verses. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. They were sharper and better than everybody that was involved. And you know who it reminds me of? It reminds me of Joseph being sold into captivity. He's bought by Potiphar, ends up running Potiphar's entire empire until he's put in prison. And when he goes to prison, God puts him in charge of the prison and then gives him the power to interpret dreams, and then he becomes second in command of all Egypt. And God knew where Joseph was. God blessed Joseph for being true to his convictions. Moses, let's think about Moses. Moses' sister put him in that basket and shoved him down the Nile to Pharaoh's daughter. And Moses is raised in the palace, raised and learns all the literature and the customs and traditions and the language of the Egyptians, and is able then later to be used by God there. The same thing with Daniel here. He's true to his convictions, and God blessed him because of it. And nobody was sharper than they were. Nobody was better. And the other great thing to me, I think, is that even though they did learn the literature and the knowledge of the Babylonians, it didn't change them because they had convictions to start with. Our children need to be trained by us here, and so that no matter what they read, no matter what they study, it's going to be a God view of that, okay? A God view. And I think that's just a wonderful thing that we need to understand that that's possible here. That if we trust God and we teach our young people, and we're should be convicted to do that here, that we teach them right and teach them the right convictions so that if they are true to those, that God will bless them, and we'll see that in them as they grow up. No one was found their equal, and they became fell under the leadership, and they became a part of the inner circle of the king there. And so, wonderful story about God's provisions because they stayed true to their convictions. The circumstances didn't control them. Their convictions controlled them in the circumstances. So what a wonderful story for us to study. Let's have a closing word. Heavenly Father, thank you for the day and your blessings. Thank you for the opportunities you give us here to study your word. Thank you for the scriptures upon which our lessons are based always. Thank you for this wonderful story about Daniel and his three friends and how they stood true to their convictions, and that you blessed them and showed them that you were in control. Thank you, Lord, that we see your sovereignty throughout the book of Daniel. Lord, help us to worship you in spirit and in truth today, and forgive us for our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Like everything else.